today I'm one of the board members of the IGDA. So, and I put together this this set of talks. So these are all buddies of mine, and we're going to start with a good friend and a neighbor of mine, David Edery, and he's going to do a talk for us about what learning from failure, right? All right. So let's get him up here and get started.
Actually, I believe very strongly that a moderator shouldn't do that much talking, so I'm going to start off by asking my panelists to introduce themselves.
Sure, go ahead, Jordan.
I'm Jordan Weissman, pretending to be Pete Parsons.
Nice.
Lou Fasulo from Z2 Live.
John Mavor from Uber Entertainment.
Mitch GITELMAN from Hairbrained Schemes.
And I'm going to start off with a very simple question, which is, how many times in your professional career did you have to fail before you started making any real traction?
Before you made any real traction. I had the problem where I didn't fail early. And so I waited until I was about middle age before I started my failure stuff.
So I think this is actually difficult to quantify in terms of a number of failure points. Certainly I've failed at many things. I would say that it's not really how many failures have you had, it's how much time have you put in and how much have you paid your dues, so to speak, in terms of learning what to do.
So how long? How much time?
Again, hard to quantify. Possibly on the order of, I would say at least, you probably need a few years under your belt before you really know what you're doing at anything, let alone making games. Some would say 10,000 hours is the magic number to become an expert. I don't know if I necessarily believe that, but let's say 10,000 hours of failure.
Right. Very nice. How about you, Lou?
I stopped keeping track around 1,000 hours of failure. What I would actually say is key to the question there is how much do you learn with each of those failures? And I think that your learning rate and kind of avoiding the catastrophic failure is kind of key. I never had any dramatic failures, though witnessed a lot of small ones.
I've had many dramatic failures. Not as many as Pete, though. And I feel good about that because he's bigger and stronger. But so we have to compensate in other ways. I guess early, you said before success. So when I was a wee one, started many companies, and first thing I do is print a business card, and then like literally before the ink was dry, the company would have failed. And so when we started Fasulo, which was a pen and paper board game 32 years ago, actually it was a superstition. I refused to print business cards for like the first 2 years. Yeah, you go through a bunch, and then it never stops. I mean, if you're going to keep being an entrepreneur, you will keep failing. It isn't like you fail enough and then after that everything works.
Yep.
But there is good news that you've said before, right, which is if you're running a startup, if you're doing a startup, everybody expects you to fail, so you might as well not worry about it, right? I mean, there's only up.
Yep.
And Jordan had this interesting comment about the business cards, and I went through the same thing. I remember when I was about 14 years old, we printed up these computer consultant business cards, and we were going to become computer consultants. And I don't look back at all that stuff as a failure, even though we never made any money or had any customers. I look at it more as a learning experience, and I think maybe that's kind of the key here is, you don't consider these to be failures, consider them to be learning experiences. We tried all kinds of stuff before we did anything that was interesting whatsoever.
And for the record, I participated in 5 learning experiences before Spryfox. 5 failed startups. Yeah. So, okay, cool. So, why don't you? It would be great if each of you could, tell us a story of your most hideous failure and what you learned from it.
Oh, good that we could relive it here in front of an audience. That sounds awesome. That's why I slept so well last night. Lou?
And back to you, Mitch.
Well, if nobody else has anything, I mean, I've been involved with a number of games that were pretty spectacular failures. I don't know if any of them would be, amongst the kind of failures that Dave has experienced because, So for me, probably the biggest, in quotes, failure would be the very first game I ever worked on, a game that no one has probably ever heard of called Radix Beyond the Void. It came out in 1995. I think we sold somewhere in the order of 5,000 or 10,000 copies, which you know, I guess doesn't sound like too much of a failure, but when you consider that, you know, a bunch of us put a couple years of our lives into it, you know, it's a little bit tough to deal with when a game comes out that you've literally spent a good portion of your life on. I was 21 years old when it came out, maybe 20 actually, and to see it kind of just go out and do nothing, you know, it's disappointing. But at the same time, I look back at that as my bachelor's degree in making games. There was no game schools back then, really. And if you wanted to know how to make games, you had to just go and make one. So I don't necessarily consider it a failure in terms of learning experience. I definitely consider it a commercial and critical failure.
Wow, it's a long list, Dave. I think, let's see, I'll tell one from me, one from Pete, because I'm being Pete as well. I think, well, back in 1990, we had a company called Virtual World Entertainment that was pioneered this kind of virtual reality entertainment centers. And we'd started to get a little wind under our wings and brought in a CEO to run the company. So I could focus on product development. About 6 months goes by, and the CEO brings me in and goes, well, here's the issue. We are going broke. We have no money. We won't make payroll this week. But I'll buy the company from you for $1, and then I'll put the money into, you know, to make payroll. And I wasn't sure if that was like this mastermind plot to try to buy the company from us for $1, or if it was just incompetence and then opportunism. But either way, we, you know, gave him a couple of expletive deletives and said, thank you, we'll figure this out ourselves. And basically ended up financing the company for the next couple of months on American Express cards, which is why I still don't have one anymore. So that was a kind of a rude awakening. I think also, similarly, Pete and I started a company called Fireball, where he had this really cool concept on a sharing of content and being able to track the viral spread of that content as it moved around the world, which was a really cool idea. And so he put together a great team, and they built it, and they launched it, and no one came to the party. So that was obviously very disappointing, and a big, like, what do we do now? Because we'd run out of money, raised money, money was gone. Well, Pete realized that, okay, so we've missed the mark. We didn't hit the kind of social viral magic, but on the other hand, we've invented some incredibly cool tech for tracking how content spreads. And he realized that that had value in the advertising market. And so it became a pivot to, that's one of those great words. Pivot means you failed, and now you're figuring out what the fuck to do. And so he pivoted to moving that into a advertising and marketing tool to be able to track how viral content spreads. And that has done very well. So.
Cool. I'll fail next. So I was working for, I think it was called Microsoft Game Studios at the time, and I was running a very big budget AAA, you know, 100-person project, that kind of thing. And the problem for us was there were multiple teams in the studio, and also there was a third team off making a product in another studio. And then that team got blended into our team, which I'm sure culturally, game teams all do it the same way, right? Should be no problem. And the mentality of how you approach a game is pretty much cookie cutter. So blending these two teams together is really no problem. So that became my task, to blend these two teams together, to onboard that first team. Then there was a big layoff, and they said, you can only make one game. And so there's well, which game? You know, that was delightful. Luckily, they didn't leave it up to us. They left it up to vice presidents who, you know, fill in the blanks. So we're going to move on. And so I'm blending these two cultures together. It doesn't quite work out so well. It's a big project. It's, you know, moving along. Eventually, there was a creative schism in the team. At that same time, my boss got promoted, and somebody had to fill that role. And so I was executive producer at the time, and then became studio manager simultaneously. So that worked out real well too. I just want to point out that that whole studio manager, executive producer thing, which, by the way, no one should ever do. If there's one takeaway, don't do that. But the key thing is that one of the vice presidents, who was prescient and knew what he was doing, said, you know, Pete Parsons, I just want to bring this back, Pete did that, and he almost died doing it. And my response is, yeah, but Pete Parsons is no Mitch Gittelman. I wish that wasn't a true story, but unfortunately it was. And so we both got our asses kicked, Pete and I, nearly simultaneously too. And so I eventually fired the art director because of the creative schism, and then about 10 or 20 artists followed, and then there was a whole making this team back, putting it back together from scratch and fixing every sort of intrinsic problem with the studio. And then, oh yeah, by the way, don't forget to make a game at the same time. And so that was nearly tragic. And you didn't mention the name. No, yeah, I don't know how I got away from not mentioning it. Thanks, Ed, for sitting in the front row. So the name of that game was Shadowrun, and it was a first-person shooter that linked the Xbox and the PC together so you can play fairly a first-person shooter. So there. Thanks for that, Ed. And now Jordan and I are actually working on a Shadowrun game. Kickstarter's closed, that's unfortunate, but we will take your money afterwards so that we could, finish it.
Mitch, quick question just to unpack. You were saying earlier, your one takeaway, don't be studio manager and executive producer. Would a way of rephrasing that be recognize your limitations, or?
Yeah, unfortunately, you could put it that way too, I suppose. Recognize your limitations, good. Don't be an arrogant little shit would be another one.
Cool, thanks, man.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I've got a good, what amounts to a pivot story. Z2 Live was originally founded to build an Xbox Live style experience for mobile. And just a few months after I came on board, Apple decided they would like to do the same thing. So it left us thinking a lot about what we wanted to be when we grew up. And we had to grow up in a hurry, and we started pivoting into free-to-play mobile games. And at that time, we still didn't really know what we wanted to be, and we started a couple projects. And going into that a few months, 3 to 4 months in, and kind of thinking about what kind of studio do we want to be and what kind of games do we want to be, definitely led to us shutting down some of those projects and getting in a situation where people had put a lot of time and effort into things that ultimately we felt didn't align with where we wanted to be longer term. So that kind of, almost like a constant pivot in terms of what's the market really want, and we haven't been doing this for very long, so we're kind of learning as we go. Definitely made it tougher on even devs and artists as well as management. So it was a fun little time. We're three for three now, so we're kind of happy, and we pretend that didn't happen.
There's something else to be said there. I've actually seen game teams form and literally break up because they were unwilling to pivot. And I think it's something that's really important. If you're going to start a company and if you're going to be, especially in a leadership role, you have to be willing to be flexible. I've seen these teams where literally it'll be maybe a programmer, an artist, and a designer will just start a small company, and one of them will be, I want to make X game, and if I don't get to make X game under X circumstances, then I don't want to do anything. And that really just doesn't work in this business. If you're that rigid, you're not going to be successful because market reality will dictate what you can really do. So flexibility is just absolutely key, and being able to pivot. I don't think there's a single person here that hasn't had to pivot to be successful. So
I'm really glad important. You said that. I want to piggyback off that just for a moment because I think it's so important. One of the things that at Spry Fox that we've tried really hard to be good at is learning when it's time to kill a project and move on, right? We experiment all the time. Our experiments can tend to be pretty wacky, so not all of them are going to work out, right? And that's, you think, you say that, okay, you get that, it should be fairly easy to kill, but it turns out it's not. There's always at least one person working on it, even though our prototype teams are very small, right? 2, 3, 4 guys. There's always one of those 2, 3, or 4 guys who falls in love with what we're working on and desperately doesn't want to kill it and advocates tremendously for not killing it. And that's actually been one of the biggest challenges for us, is figuring out how to put systems in place to prevent us from letting a project drag on, because that's the ultimate failure, right? The failure that never ends. So like we've started to do certain things, like we won't let artists into prototyping teams, which is a little crazy, right? Because they can their perspective can be really valuable. But the problem is the minute you start pumping in some cool art in there, people start to get attached to the project in a way that we found is tremendously unhealthy. So like for months, we won't allow artists to be involved in a prototype other than playing it and giving feedback, but they're not allowed to actually like give us art for the game. And like we do other little things like that, all in the name of kind of like allowing us to pivot, for lack of a better word. So anyway, okay, next question. What type of failure is the most lethal type of failure to a game developer, and what can you do to kind of mitigate the risk of that?
I think actually you just probably called out the biggest one, which is not knowing when to call it quits, right? You know, I think the creative process, you fall in love with what you're making, and it's really important to be able to realize when it's not working and to kill it. It's also the other issue I see, just repeated time after time after time with developers, is to put all the sexy stuff in first and figure out that gameplay thing later. We'll get there. We can't really, you know, until we have like $1 million worth of art, we can't really tell if the game's working or not. All right, if you're saying that to yourself, you're already off on the way wrong track, right? As you said, it doesn't take any art to know if your core gameplay functions are working. And you know, I still see it today. Many companies, you know, like, well, we'll kick off pre-production and the cinema at the same time. So we're spending all this money on these big, expensive cinemas and story and all the rest of the stuff, and it's like, and you still don't have your core game.
That was my first failure, actually. Forgive me, I was working on a product with a team in England, and I flew out there to see how things were going, and I found out that they had made all the cinemas, and the story wasn't really baked. So the story then became, well, we have to link these cinemas together. They're already made. Should be awesome.
Well, and it also means usually you have to end up, you know, like making your game try to reflect the cinemas, which is just back-ass broken. And so anyway, yeah, those are classic repeating cycles of failure, right? So always, you know, one, know when to kill it. Two, you know, figure out very small prototype teams to get core game dynamics down very inexpensively. And if they're not working, kill them, move on to the next, move on to the next, move on to the next.
We have a name for that process called white boxing, which is you build the game with white boxes. If it's not fun with white boxes, it's not going to be fun any other way,
It'll get more fun.
with rare exception.
Yeah. We should put out a game called White Box, and then use metrics to decide when to add more.
Absolutely brilliant.
That would be
That's a
another
pivot right there.
presentation. Yeah, good pivot, good pivot. What's the question, Dave?
Here, let's jump into my phone just messed up. Let's talk about interpersonal failure. So what do you do when an important relationship, either inside or outside the studio, starts to fall apart?
That's bad. So, you know, it's interesting. We were having a little conversation before this about who are you working with? And I think before you even get to the point where you can have an interpersonal failure, you have to ask yourself how you got to that point. You know, in my case, we were discussing working with family, which is something that many entrepreneurs deal with over the years. My very first company that I ever started was literally, I was partners with my father. And I think choosing your partners and your employees carefully is actually part of the key to this. Now, if you do start getting into a situation where badness is happening, I don't know that I have a magical solution or an answer to Dave's question that actually is generic. I think you have to approach things with a level of maturity, and you know, you certainly can't rely on the other person to take the high road. You need to do that yourself, and hopefully you both do it and things just work out. Sometimes you do need to separate ways. I would just say, you know, be careful with who you work with, and if you have an established relationship with someone, don't necessarily think that being business partners or having an employer-employee relationship is a smart move. Really think it through before you get into bed with someone.
Yeah, I think choosing partners and employees is, you know, a microcosm of choosing a spouse. In the end of the day, you're going to spend as much time with them as you are your spouse if you're in a startup, for sure. And so you really do want to be extremely careful about those decisions, because the divorces in this case are as expensive as the divorces at home. I think that's certainly one factor. The other thing, I know a mistake I've made in the past is that I would try way too hard to hold talented people when it wasn't right to do so, right? So just like the person is so good at what they do that I'm desperately trying to hold them into the company. I'm changing everything I can, organizational structures, assignments, whatever I can do to hold them into the company. And you know what? It's just the wrong thing to do. If they're not happy contributing at the right level in the company, then their talent isn't really being put to use, and it's undermining the rest of the culture in the company. And so you really do have to always look at that balance between individual talent and just how well they're playing with the rest of the team and how the team is gelling. And that, realize that sometimes the most talented person is not actually the right person for the team.
Without a doubt, I'd like to add on to that too, because in the same horror scenario I was telling you about earlier, one of the creative leads for design, I had handpicked sort of out of the crowd. It's like, okay, you could tell this guy had something. He had true, genuine talent. And so I chose him. I really put my chips kind of, in a roulette, sort of all the chips on this guy, and trained him up. And really invested my personal time to add value to him, both as a designer, as a design lead, as a manager, that kind of thing. And when things started to go south for the product, we found an interesting flaw in his psychology, right? And he became hardened, right, as a human being, and became terribly, terribly challenging to work with. And that caused a major ripple through the entire project, right? Up and down, sideways, it was amazing. And unfortunately, because of the major investment I had placed on him, all my chips, I was not prepared to dump this guy. Even when the project got to a point where, all right, I've gotten everything I really need out of him, I could pivot to somebody else, and I didn't because of my, my personal investment and my desire to see that through. And that was a major mistake. One of my major takeaways on that project, and many of them, kind of the way Jordan was talking about, is you have to expunge your team. You have to expunge your studio of negative influences, right? Negative energy contracts, positive energy expands, and I've never seen it done any other way and succeed. And so you have to find those cancers on your team, unfortunately, and you just have to rip them out, regardless of how hard it hurts you. And for the long-term good of everyone, you'll see what happens to everybody when you have that accountability and you take care of things, and everybody else can then breathe better. And it's an unfortunate lesson to have to learn, but believe me, it's in there now deeply.
So I'm detecting another theme here, which is kind of wrapped around this whole failure thing, which is, and I think what you're getting a lot of is the burden of being in the leadership position. You're hearing a lot of, oh, I had to, rip the cancer out, and I had to, make these hard decisions. And I think failure is just another kind of side of that same coin. You have to accept that you're going to fail and not have a fear of doing so. And a lot of these other really tough, difficult things that you have to do when you run a company are all kind of flip sides of the same coin, as well as actually making all the money.
Actually, I think something. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think kind of leading off of that, a key thing when you're building a team is really make sure that you guys share values. And when you have shared values, it's really easy to get through some of the tougher situations. They'll kind of bring you together. You can make decisions in a way that makes sense for the team. And ultimately, you know where that person or group of folks is going to go when hard questions come up. And it's kind of an important place to start.
I was just going to build on what these guys have said, because I think one of the key things as both a leader on the team as well as any member of the team is accepting failure and saying, okay, not like where does the blame go, but say, hey, you know what, these were decisions we made, we set out to do this and it didn't work. All right, so let's not like point fingers and figure out whose fault it is. It was our fault. We made the decisions. What do we learn from it? How can we make better decisions next time, right? And not spend the time trying to wash the blame off you, but just say, hey, look, this was ultimately, our team made the decisions. Our team's going to pay the price. We're going to learn from it. We're going to do better.
Alternatively to Jordan's philosophy, you can just start with a core value of failure is unacceptable, and then you're in a better spot.
Should be fine. Nothing bad will come of that.
I'm curious, Mitch, you were saying something earlier that made me think to ask this question. A lot of, in terms of building the right team, having the right people around.
Right.
You often, when I was first starting out as an entrepreneur, I used to get a lot of advice from people, and it was amazing how polarizing it would be. A bunch of people, oh, you should work with close friends, people you trust, and then a bunch of other people, oh, you should never work with a close friend. That's a disaster waiting to happen.
Right.
Just curious if you guys have any thoughts on the subject of working with friends.
Yes, I do. I've done it twice now. I've had 2 business partners, and both were friends. So my first business partner was when I first got into the industry, really, and we sort of jumped ship from our paper and pencil role-playing game companies into making games. And in that case, he was my very best friend, right? And this is, I don't know, 25 years ago or something like that, and still is to this day. And we were able to make decisions as a team, execute as a team, and nothing bad ever happened with that because we just knew we were right for each other, if that makes sense. Sort of the way Jordan was talking about, right? I mean, it's a marriage, it really is, and, you know, that worked, right? You don't go to sleep angry, you know. I learned that from Rob and Laura Petrie. So, and then my second business partner after a long stint at Microsoft is Jordan, and that one's interesting because we're not best friends. We're very close, and that also just works for me. Your mileage may vary in front of a microphone, which is awesome. But, you know, I think the friendship over the years has helped us so that for us, we didn't become partners until we had known each other for something in the neighborhood of 25 years or something like that, also working together off and on. And by that point, you just know who the other person is. You just know that it's going to work and that you're going to trust each other and have each other's back. Jordan?
Well, I was going to say, I would say all of that is true, but an interesting addendum to that story is like 5 years ago, we considered partnering on a project.
Oh, yeah.
And I ended that by saying, I don't want to with you
Right.
at this point, because he had just come through this experience and he was kind of bitter and angry, and
You used the word hard. You said, you are hard. Like,
yeah,
yes,
so
I am.
I said, I don't want to, and so I said, I don't want to work with you at this time.
that's
you
right.
know?
That's a good point.
So, I mean, I think if you are friends, you have to have that level to be able to say,
Exactly,
no.
yeah.
You know, no.
Yeah, and it was actually easy to have that conversation, too, and I respected it deeply. It's like, yeah, I'm hard as a rock. You know, I'll get back to you later when I'm soft again.
But we were talking about this earlier. I've made the constant mistake, in quotations, of working with family members, which is a landmine-strewn kind of situation. And I'd say most of the time it's worked out well for me. It is difficult to fire family members, but I've had to do that. And you know, sometimes it adds an extra burden, though. It is definitely an extra burden to the business. Now, it might be all right to do that, but you got to recognize that going in, that working with good friends or working with family members does add an extra kind of layer to the kind of karma level of angst, and you have to be, you know, either ready to deal with that or at least acknowledge it.
So how do you mitigate the risks of that, aside from willingness to part ways when necessary? Like, what else can you do to make sure that your family member business relationship doesn't explode?
I mean, I think in the broad strokes, it's not too different from how you should treat any other partner or employee, which is complete transparency. I mean, we've always tried to do that at any of the businesses we've started, be really transparent about both the challenges, the opportunities, and even the division of spoils, kind of right up front. That doesn't guarantee you that things aren't going to go sour later, but at least it, you know, it reduces the potential for it.
So I've had many years' experience of working with friends, and I would say that I'd be much more willing to go into business from the perspective of a partnership with a friend, because I think, as Jordan said, it is almost like getting married when you go into business with someone else or with a group of people. It's like a group marriage. Having friends as employees, I think, is actually, in some ways, even more difficult. Because, you know, sometimes you do have to fire, you know, Jordan's like, I have to fire family members, you know, it's rough, and having to lay anyone off or fire anyone is extremely difficult to begin with, and when it's your friend, you know, you could potentially be throwing something away there. So I'm pretty circumspect about hiring people that I consider to be close friends to this day, and I have done so even in the last few years. And I would just say be really careful about what's important to you. Is your friendship more important than just a potential employee? And I think in most cases it is. Then there's the ones that are pissed off because you don't hire them, so you can't really win. But just be careful. But as far as business partners go, you spend a tremendous amount of time with those people. I don't tend to fraternize too much with my business partner outside of work, simply because we see each other all day, every day, sometimes 7 days a week for months on end. So there's that aspect of it too. You want to have some other people that you can go and hang out with that aren't, you're not working with constantly. But I guess just be careful.
I would say starting something with friends can work really well if you've worked with that person and been in the trenches with them for a while, and especially been in a stressful situation. And again, just going back to knowing how people react in those down situations. The good times are really easy. Throwing back beers together when something goes well, that's the easy part. But getting through the harder times is something you need to be ready for. And often when you've worked with someone for a while and they've become a friend, that's kind of the ideal scenario.
Cool. Thanks, guys. So I think this will be the last question for me, and then I want to be able to open it up to the audience. When things are going to hell in a handbasket, what do you do to keep your spirits up? What do you do to avoid wallowing in anger or despair?
Pivot.
I like this theme.
I give myself 24 hours to wallow, and I acknowledge that for the next 24 hours I'm allowed to, and that's okay. And then when that time limit's over, it's time to get back to work. And for me, and this is what I tell my kids, and I'll tell everybody, it's just the only thing you can ever do is take action, right? Resting, I guess, is action, but make it active, right? And so I just tend to get back to work, right? When in doubt, do a risk analysis, figure out what the biggest problems are, and start attacking them right away. So for me, it's always about action.
I think he's totally correct. Action is the key. Keep busy. Drink a lot of margaritas. But
That's an action.
that is an action.
Yes.
But I would say you're absolutely right. You just want to make sure that you sit down, analyze what's going on, formulate a plan, and continue pushing forward as hard as you can. I think Dave's question, you were more like, how do you deal with depression and things like that? And I think
avoid it, actually.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of mental tricks. People have their own tricks. In my mind, I usually just refuse to accept fear and just sit there and analyze the situation. If you can sit down and say, what are the actions that I can concretely take to fix this situation, think those through, commit to an action plan, and then go home and watch Breaking Bad or whatever. That's what I do.
I agree with everything they said. I mean, to me, the depression to me is fought off by work, and so being able to break down a problem into little pieces and then just start knocking down those little pieces one at a time. That's how I start to recover and start to feel good about the fact that there's a route back up.
If you've got if you know kind of the moment of truth is coming for a product, it's good to have plan B, C, and D. So you know what you're going to step into right away. It keeps people moving in some direction. It makes it so you don't lose momentum. And I think as a leader, you don't want to be seen not knowing where to go. Certainly those moments always arrive, but hopefully you've kind of conquered some of that stuff beforehand.
I think one last thing, sorry, because I deal with this all the time, unfortunately. We all do, but I take a walk. This is just my tactic. I take a walk, and I figure out what's that thing that's causing me the most problem. On the timeline, when did it start? So I can figure out other trigger points that led to it. And then the next thing is to label them. Is this ego or not? Right? And because that's as we may have noticed already, that's probably the biggest weakness, right? So ego, oh, okay, then screw that, and action. So I label.
That's great. Out of curiosity, sorry, just one more thing on this topic. When you guys are in one of these moments where something really bad is happening, and you've made it very clear, you're putting your action plan together, you're trying to avoid, ego-driven decisions. how much advice do you try to, like, how much advice is too much advice, right? Because I know that that's definitely a problem for me, where if I'm in a really bad situation, I know a lot of wonderful people who have always been very kind to me over the years, and I can't help but get on the phone and spend ridiculous numbers of hours talking it through with them, and inevitably you end up with disparate advice, right? Almost inevitably. So how much advice is too much? Like, how do you go through the process of getting feedback from people who can help you?
I think give yourself a budget, and literally just say, I'm going to spend, a day gathering advice or 2 days gathering advice, whatever it is, and then I'm going to Pareto that, and I'm going to figure out, which of these are the ones that it speaks to me the most and feels like the right thing for my team and my product and my company, and then, start acting on it. I think it can be very self-serving to get caught in the loop of, well, I'll just keep asking, because that means I don't actually have to make a decision.
Yep.
And so you want to put a hard deadline on that and say, no, at this point, I really have to make a decision.
Cool. All right.
Yeah, what he said.
Good. So okay. So let's open it up. You guys have any? Shoot, man.
So we're talking about. This has been a lot of talk about failure in the very high level, and I think about failure in game design. Like I read The Trenches, which is that Penny Arcade offshoot about testers in hell and all that. But almost all of you are in a different position about that sort of level of failure, because 1, 2, 3 at least are in a very free-to-play mode, where failure within a project, in a free-to-play model, or it can be modified at any time. This can be patched. We can address this sort of quickly. Does that make failure better or worse? Like the idea of like having to deal with failure more often because it's that modified, or is that?
That's one of the major reasons we do what we do. I mean, in my company, absolutely. I mean, precisely because I hate the idea of I'm going to spend $1 million making a game and I'm going to throw it up there and, oh, it didn't do well. Well, I'm fucked. Like I can't. I understand that people have been making games that way for, decades. I can't imagine doing it myself. It seems so ass backwards. So yeah, no, I think you can call it free to play, you can call it service-based games, whatever you call it, right? I think it's a superior way of developing games precisely because you actually get a chance to learn from your failures within the context of that project and improve the game, and maybe it won't be a failure at the end of the day.
At Z2, I would say that failures kind of go in the run book and become part of the best practices. So we look forward to failing fast, and we expect to. We also kind of make predictions about how things will work and look back at what we thought and kind of figure out where our assumptions went wrong. So failure is a big part of getting better at this stuff, games as a service specifically.
Let me ask a question with a question. Which is worse, spending, let's say, 3 years of your life working on something, it goes from basic concept all the way through to shipping, certification, and then the game comes out and it utterly and spectacularly craters, and you've kind of like, well, I guess I just have to brush off and move on to the next thing. Or releasing something, it doesn't do as well as you thought, and having the opportunity to, on a weekly basis, improve it, respond to customer feedback, and actually move it to a place where you're happy and the customers are happy. I would say, service-based gaming is much more empowering from a developer standpoint. Not to mention, you can launch things earlier than you would have with different feature sets than you would have in the past. You can be more experimental. It's super refreshing, quite frankly, to be able to do that.
And it's not unilateral either, right? It's not throwing a game over a wall and people will play it, review it, and then, well, the feedback comes back.
Yeah, but I don't think a lot of what we're saying here is actually limited to that. I mean, I've
Yeah,
been
for sure.
making games for 32 years, and in that mod of kind of service, game as a service, only for 8 months, 10 months, and the learnings are still the same. It's just you have the advantage of doing it quicker. I mean, when we would spend 5 years to make a giant, PC title or a giant Xbox title, you would artificially try to create opportunities for failure through testing, right? But that doesn't tell you really what the audience is going to like, what's going to happen when it's out into the wild. So you really only truly learned when it shipped. And then you tried to react as best you could with whatever circumstance was available at that part of the time in the industry. So I think the lessons and the approaches are the same. It's just the time frames are dramatically shorter now.
I mean, to go to Jordan's point, in 2010, when we released Monday Night Combat, the only external players that ever got to play the game were in the Microsoft Usability Lab. We had maybe 50 people that were just raw that ever got to come in when the game was finished and try it out. You know, compare that to, I don't know, let's use Minecraft as an example where, I don't know, is it still alpha? Is it officially released? Yeah, I guess it is. But, you know, he got to, you know, release it in kind of a fresh state and let people try it out. I think that's super, mega, incredibly valuable. And I look forward to doing that more.
There's also some, briefly, we haven't really talked about the marketing side of failure, but there is a sort of a marketing benefit to all this, right? Like you imagine, you know, someone spends, again, 5 years and X millions of dollars making a game, and then they launch it, and they have to be super, super paranoid about exactly when they launch it, because they only get one shot, right? So God forbid the next Half-Life is shipping at the same time as your shooter, because if it is your host, right? So you go with the games as a service model, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, I mean, yes, I would like to have a nice launch, but if I don't, it's really not the end of the world, right? Because I'm going to have multiple micro launches that come after the main launch for hopefully years to come. So from a marketing perspective, which is something people don't tend to talk about very often, like it just seems so superior to me to do things this way. But anyway, Nick.
The opposite of failure is success, that magical time when you stop pivoting. You want to tell us a story about one day when you suddenly woke up and found you had a success in your hand and how you realized you had a success rather than a place to pivot again.
It just led to more angst. So we recently ran a Kickstarter for a game called Shadowrun Returns, and bless your heart for the whistle, thank you. And we woke up the next morning to find that we had hit our goal, and that was a form of success that was absolutely staggeringly frightening. So that was a huge success. What was the second part of your question?
Well, I mean, suddenly you wake up and realize I have a success in
Yeah.
my hand. That magical moment,
Yeah.
transition from some bits that we don't
Yeah.
have to change it anymore, we
Yeah.
just carry on.
Oh, no, I don't know about that part. Yeah, for real, it's just like press your bet.
I'll be
all in.
perfectly honest and say that I don't know if I've ever felt that way about anything.
Yeah, right.
And I think you're going to find a lot of people feel that way because I know for me, it's climbing a mountain. You know, you're scaling the walls, and then you're climbing the mountain. You get up to the top, and then you're like, oh, there's more peaks in the distance. And you know, I definitely haven't had the kind of success that makes me feel like I've climbed to the top of Mount Everest. And honestly, that's what keeps me going, gets me up in the morning. I think goal setting is extremely important. And you know, when I think back to when I was a teenager working on games, you know, I would consider myself to be extremely successful today based on that perspective. But on my perspective of today, I feel like there's a lot more to go. So you know, I think handling success actually is a lot harder than handling failure in a lot of ways.
I'm actually really glad we're talking about this because it's actually a huge personal challenge for me. Any elation that I feel when we have a success in our company lasts a matter of hours usually, like tops. Maybe if I'm lucky, it goes for a day. And then I wake up the next day and I'm like, oh, okay, now what? I think learning to celebrate the successes is possibly as important as learning to deal with the failures because otherwise you're just always on this treadmill. And it's so easy to be on that treadmill. And actually your capacity to tackle that treadmill and to want to push for the next peak, as John was mentioning, is actually one of the things that I think differentiates successful entrepreneurs from failed entrepreneurs. So it's great that we have that drive in us because I think that's what enables us to do what we do. But at the same time, you know, if you don't want to be lying in your bed 80 years from now and kind of unhappy and wondering like why you worked all the time and didn't ever have fun, like you have to learn to stop and celebrate the success. And that's something I'm very bad at.
I also think, Dave, you know, to bring, you know, the original question before this was, how do you look at this, maybe not from an entrepreneurial standpoint, but from a career perspective? And I feel like I've learned a lot of things in my career, a tremendous amount of things in my career about things like programming and stuff like that. And I think you can apply these lessons to your career, not just to like a company or something like that. You know, what's next? What new thing are you going to learn? What new skill are you going to acquire? What project are you going to take on? I think you know, you can approach your career from that perspective as well.
I think I echo that, but I think it's also when you feel that moment of success. When is that? When you're cash flow positive. You know, when you got when you've built up a kitty in the bank. I mean, typically, risk takers look at a kitty in the bank as okay. You know, now we can go bet more. I can put more on the line, and we can go out and try new product. Perversely, actually, the early failures are the easiest ones. When you fail in the garage, when you're just a handful of you and no one knows. So emotionally, it's actually the easiest one, right? It might be the worst financially for you, but emotionally, it's the easiest to recover from. It's after you've had success and you're kind of in the public eye, and then you fail, it's actually much more emotionally difficult. And it becomes this kind of inhibitor to taking risks. It's my theory for why larger companies just take less and less risk as they go, because the kind of emotional toll of failing in the public eye is so much higher. And to me, that's actually one of the hardest things to kind of engineer your company around, is the ability to take risks after success, you know, and to accept failure after success rather than the early, easier failure.
Great answer.
I agree with that completely. At Z2 Live, when we launched our first game, we had done this great pivot, and you know, we didn't have as much cash in the bank as when we had started, because we had built a great platform for mobile that no one was really going to use, except for maybe us. And when our first title launched, we got up in the morning, looked at numbers, and said, wow, we're actually paying our bills. This is great. And so, you know, the bar for what you feel is successful continues to go up. We're at 120 employees now. We've been profitable for 22 months. And, you know, we don't want to cancel projects because we don't want to let down employees that have put their heart into things. We don't want to see something fail. And we certainly don't want to get to the point where we're actually digging into the bank and considering if we're the right size for, you know, whatever number of shots on goal we've missed at some point in the future. So the toll does get heavier, as Jordan said, and we still look for ways to take risks and do things that are kind of meaningful and impactful for us in the industry. And I think that's an important part of kind of taking risk and failure into account.
I just got one last one, Dave, because as I'm sitting up here listening to everybody else's stories, it occurs to me the key takeaway for me about failure personally that I've learned, the biggest thing that I've learned about my own failures are linked. There's no such thing as a period in your life until it ends, so everything's a comma, right? And I didn't learn that until after I had failed pretty dramatically. And in the depths of my personal despair at my biggest failure, you know, it's pretty hard to see the end. See, you know, that light at the end of the tunnel, is that a train coming, you know, that whole thing. But the biggest thing that I've learned about failure that only occurred to me sitting up here is that it then becomes a story. Eventually it's going to be a story that you tell somebody else and learn from, and you're going to make new stories after that. But that's my biggest learning on the whole thing is, don't worry, it's just going to become a story, and then you can own it, you can objectify it, you can label it, this is Mitch's horror story, and move on and make success stories.
Nice. Cool. Ed? Oh. Sorry, guys. I would love to take more questions. It looks like we're out of time. It was a great pleasure to see such a full room in the morning. Thank you for coming to the panel. Appreciate it.